Rabbim icabet kıl, Yirakta ana duasını. Ulug Rabbim icabet kıl, Zindanda ata duasını. Ulug Rabbim icabet kıl, Musafir yetim duasını. Ulug Rabbim icabet kıl, Vatansiz g'arib duasını. Ulug Rabbim nasib ayla, Ko'rishga vatan azodini. Ulug Rabbim nasib ayla, Ko'rishga zolim zavolini. Ulug Rabbim nasib ayla, Ko'rishga onam jamolini. Ulug Rabbim nasib ayla, Suyishga vatan tuprog'ini. Ulug Rabbim nasib ayla, Kezishga vatan gulbog'ini. Ulug Rabbim nasib ayla, Vatan tuprog'ida o'lishni.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, dear brothers and sisters, and welcome to another special episode of Talk is Turkestan. I know we haven't seen each other in a while, but we do have a special guest for you. And this is the second time on this show. We have none other than Mr. Drew Pavlou. For those of you who don't know who Drew Pavlou is, he is an Australian rights activist, human rights activist. He's known for his criticism against the Chinese regime and the Chinese Communist Party. His activism started when he had some on-campus protests in support of the 2019-20 Hong Kong protests, which got a lot of scrutiny by his university. And basically, he was highlighting how universities, to increase their relationships with China, will not highlight human rights atrocities done by the Chinese regime, especially against Hong Kong, Uyghurs, Tibetans. Without further ado, if you guys missed on part one, you can see the whole story of how Drew started. We're just gonna, and that video was done around 5 months ago. We're gonna basically continue of what's been happening in the last 4 or 5 months with his life and talk about some other issues relating to the Chinese regime. I'll let Mr. Pavlou do all the talking now. How you doing, mate?
Hey man, thank you, Aslan, for having me, bro. Yeah, it's been a long time since we last talked, 5 months. Things have been very crazy, hectic since then.
Yeah.
Life changed quite a bit.
Yeah, well, I want to get straight into it. So again, I don't want to get into the stuff that, your intro and everything. So I believe the last interview was done in June.
Yes.
And since then, what's happened? You've obviously got some political support by various people in the Australian government. And what's really interesting about your story is, I think you're the most high-profile activist that's like non-Chinese, or like that's never actually been within the borders of China or citizen or anything like this. So yeah, what's been happening basically? So it's a catch-up.
Yeah. It is a sort of funny fact. I've never actually been able to travel to China, which is really upsetting to me because I would love to travel to China. I would love to go to Hong Kong. I'd love to visit, East Turkestan and see the great Uyghur sites and stuff like that. But unfortunately, that's probably never going to be a possibility for me, given
Never say never. Never say never.
Well, yes, one day when the regime falls, but in the meantime, it's going to be very difficult under Xi Jinping, because the Chinese Foreign Ministry has personally singled me out for condemnation, and Chinese state media have attacked me multiple times. So at the moment, I think if I stepped foot in China, I probably wouldn't be coming back. But it's been crazy time since we last caught up. So when we were last speaking, I think UQ had just expelled me for 2 years, and the case attracted a lot of attention because what was really clear to people was that I was being targeted politically by UQ. They had mounted this whole case against me as punishment for my protests on campus about Hong Kongers and Uyghurs. And again, it was simply due to the university's very close economic ties with China. So because UQ relied on China for 20, 30% of its revenue, hundreds of millions of dollars every year, they could not allow me to protest on campus because that would threaten the university's ties with the Chinese government. The Chinese government could stop the flow of Chinese students to UQ, and then overnight UQ would not be able to pay. UQ's budget overnight would be destroyed. Vice Chancellor Peter Hoy was not going to be able to get his $1.2 million salary and his $200,000 bonus for deepening ties with China. So UQ, they begun this whole case against me, very politically motivated. And since then, a lot has changed. So my lawyer, Tony Morris QC, he represented me, defended me before the University of Queensland's highest internal appeal body. Still, it was a body that was stacked out by the university's employees. Still, it was never going to give me a fair trial because it was still always going to be, staffed with UQ employees. And the UQ lawyers that they brought in, and UQ spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on some of the best lawyers in Australia. They brought in these lawyers to direct the university appeals body to uphold the verdict to expel me. Tony Morris, he delivered such a good defense that even UQ's own sort of kangaroo court had to lessen the sentence. Eventually, they actually exonerated me on 9 of 11 charges. So 90% of that original 200-page document they leveled against me was basically chucked out by their own staff who were being directed by the university lawyers to expel me. Wow. Even their own staff had to go, 90% of this is just straight up lies, manufactured. We discovered in the course of that multiple allegations that UQ had listed against me had actually been completely manufactured. The university had actually just straight up invented some of these student complaints. So, for example, they screenshotted comments where I had got into some online internet beef with some fellow students who had been taunting me over my mate's suicide. It was a really dark time. I responded really harshly, a lot of swear words, etc. UQ took screenshots of that and then basically said, "Oh, these students have complained." Then the students in questions actually wrote to my lawyer and said, "We never complained. UQ's actually just made this up." Wow. So UQ was exposed as having manufactured so many of these allegations against me. They reduced the sentence to 6 months, which still had the effect of removing me from the UQ Senate, which was the board that governed the university. So I'd been democratically elected by students to that position to fight for things like reevaluating UQ's ties with China while the terrible genocide of Uyghurs takes place. And UQ's Senate, they kicked me off. So the democratic vote of the students was invalidated. And they barred me from campus. So every time I stepped foot on campus, they would threaten me with security and police. They also banned me from running in the student elections, which I'd been planning on doing for a while. And it was simply because they didn't want me to be in charge of the university student union, which was like a $20 million operation. If I'd been in charge of that, our activism against UQ would have been, taken to the next level, and they didn't want that to happen. So they colluded with a lot of they colluded with some of our rivals in student politics. People registered a fake Drew Pavlou party to steal votes away from us. They had the security. That's just a crazy story in itself. Like to try get around UQ's total ban on me running in student elections. My friend changed his name to Drew Pavlou and ran as Drew Pavlou on the ticket, with the promise of handing over power to me if we won. And UQ, to try and stop that from happening, they allowed other students to register their own fake Drew Pavlou ticket to steal votes from us. And they brought in this. Yeah, there it is. And that's my mate changed his name to, it was crazy. It was a crazy plan.
That's,
and UQ,
when I saw this, I thought this was amazing. I mean,
it was
awesome.
It was pretty funny because like we were just trying to basically show UQ, like they'd gone to so much effort to try stop me from running in the election. So with my mate changing his name for me, like it was a clever trick to get around their rules, but unfortunately they knew how to like do us over. So yeah, they let these other guys register a fake Drew Pavlou party to steal votes. There was another student team hacked into the student union database, stole hundreds of student numbers to use against us. Like, so they did a mass text campaign to make sure that we would lose. And they did that.
Like what's happening in the United States or no?
Look, people know that I'm very critical of Trump, and I've had a lot of backlash from Hong Kongers and Uyghurs and stuff based on that. Look, my position is just simply, I don't actually believe Trump's that. I don't believe Trump really.
We'll get into Trump later. But did your mate end up becoming part of the Senate or no?
Yeah. So what happened was UQ basically threw everything they could at us, everything in the kitchen sink to try and sink our campaign. So fake Drew Pavlou parties to steal votes, funnel votes away from us. Rival tickets hacked into a database to steal student numbers to use against us. And the university, they weren't, prior to the election week, they never tried to enforce the campus ban that they set on me. And then suddenly it was voting week and they would have their security there saying, get off campus right now or we'll call the police, because the terms of the suspension are that you can't come onto campus. So UQ threw every single thing they could at us. In the end, we were 100 votes away from winning the election. And that was gutting. That really gutted me because we had so many plans. If we ran again, we could have really powered up the movement at UQ some more. We could have brought in speakers to speak about these issues like Uyghurs, Tibetans, could have taken a strong stand on the part of the student body against the university's deals with China. And unfortunately, they just basically threw every dirty trick that they had at us and we weren't able to get over the line. And but while we failed in that area, there were other successes.
When you mean you weren't able to get over the line, what do you mean?
Oh, well, we came 100 votes away from winning. And if it weren't for small things like for example, the people who registered their own fake Drew Pavlou party, the university allowed another team to register my name and steal votes by basically going, we're the real Drew Pavlou party, even though my mate and me had organized. Yeah, there was just there were all these dirty tricks, and with all that combined together, we actually came 100 votes away. We did a good effort considering how strongly the university resisted that. They tried so hard to destroy it, and we came really close regardless, but still very disappointing. But we have had, even though we lost in that era, we have had a lot of successes elsewhere. So I think the big success was that we were able to get a government inquiry into foreign interference at Australian universities. So working together with Bob Katter, who's this sort of crazy, funny, MP from North Queensland, who's really strong on, defending Australia's sovereignty and stuff like that. Yeah. Bob Katter, he took on my cause and championed it. And we campaigned together for the Parliament to do an inquiry into the CCP's influence at Australian universities so that they could look into what happened at UQ against me and other examples as well at other Australian universities across the country. So, for example, July, I think it was, an academic posted an article that was critical of the Chinese government's crackdown on Hong Kong. She was at the University of New South Wales, which is one of Australia's best universities. She posted this article criticizing China on Hong Kong. And Chinese international students at that university, they organized a campaign where they began attacking the university and pressuring the university to not only delete that article, but also to sack the academic Elaine Pearson. And that case as well, that case combined with my case at UQ, it put so much pressure on the government. And Bob Katter, as you see here, he was such a legend. He championed my case. Not many members of the Parliament were willing to stand up and help me because obviously it's a very controversial issue. And China is so important economically to Australia, so all these politicians don't want to offend China. And Bob Katter was the one with the balls to stand up and actually help me. And without his help, man, we never could have got this inquiry into the CCP interference at Australian universities. He was able to start, he was campaigning so loudly for it in Parliament that MPs within the Liberal Party, which is the governing party in Australia, they begun defecting from the party and actually started backing him on this issue, because the Liberal Party leadership in Canberra, they didn't want to have this inquiry because they knew that it would piss off China. They knew that China would respond with like trade boycotts, trade sanctions. They would punish Australia for having this type of inquiry. And so the government's official position was against it. And Bob Katter, he was campaigning so hard and he worked so hard at doing the numbers. He started to get some government MPs to defect from the Liberal Party and say, hang on, we should have this inquiry. And then the government caved into the pressure and they allowed it to go ahead. And that was just such a huge thing. So now the Joint Parliamentary Committee on Intelligence, which is chaired by Andrew Hastie, who is a really well-respected MP. He's actually often talked of as a future Prime Minister of Australia. He chairs this intelligence committee, and they're going to have a full, wide-ranging probe into what happened, not just at UQ, but in other universities across Australia, with regard to CCP interference. And they'll have the full power to subpoena documents. So, like for example, my lawyer, Tony Morris, he did a Freedom of Information request at UQ to request UQ documents relating to my case. And we found out that UQ had compiled 14,000 pages worth of documents just on me in 2 months. So we're talking like an insane amount of surveillance, writing. Like the university compiled a huge truckload of documents on me, like including surveillance of me as a student for months. And we were able to find that out through Freedom of Information request, but they ultimately only allowed us to see 1,000 of those 14,000 pages worth of documents. 13,000 pages of these documents at UQ that relate to my case remain secret. So basically
they were doing Chinese-style surveillance, AI surveillance on you on Australian soil, on an Australian, in an Australian university.
14,000 pages worth of documents.
Wow.
What that involved was the university going through all my social media, compiling their legal case against me, investigating me. And UQ, they would only allow us to see 1,000 pages worth of these documents. Still 13,000 pages are kept secret because the university is arguing it's not in the public interest to see. And you know what? This intelligence committee, chaired by Andrew Hastie, they'll subpoena all the documents and we'll be able to see what happened here at UQ. And they'll also be able to subpoena witnesses, so they can have the Vice-Chancellor and the Chancellor of the university, Peter Hoy and Peter Varghese, come and testify in Canberra and explain what they did at UQ, explain why the university took on this really incredible case against me, because ultimately they were the guys who were calling the shots at UQ, and it had to stop. The buck has to stop somewhere. If the university is compiling tens of thousands of pages worth of documents on me, that would have had to have been done with the authorization of the Vice Chancellor and Chancellor. And they can now explain that before Parliament in Canberra. And they're also going to likely have me come down and testify too. And so it will be a tremendous opportunity to lift the veil on what's happened here at UQ and actually allow the public to scrutinize the universities and see and uncover what's going on here. So this is a huge victory for our cause. I think when the Parliament investigates UQ, they will uncover the wrongdoing that went on here. This whole time, we've all known that they did this. They took on this crazy case against me to punish me for talking about China. Well, the Intelligence Committee will actually be able to find the evidence for this. They're going to be able to look at the UQ internal documents that they've kept from the public, all these secret documents. They'll be able to investigate this. And I think at that point, we're going to be able to have justice. So a huge victory in our cause. And I'm so lucky for someone like Bob Katter to back me. Also, the backing of the Australian public. We had a documentary about the cause aired on 60 Minutes, which is one of Australia's premier documentary sort of news.
I believe you have 2 or 3 episodes on there.
Actually appeared in 2 separate episodes, which is which is just like I'm so thankful for that, because that brought the case to the attention of the wider Australian public. And it was at that point that I had thousands of people messaging me and going, "Oh, like, we support you, stay strong, keep going." That really kept me going. And it was the pressure of the public pressure that 60 Minutes mounted, and that Bob Catter mounted. Bob Catter came on board after 60 Minutes. It was that just turned things around. And now we've got this inquiry, and we're going to be able to, I think they're going to uncover what's gone on here. We'll have justice.
Were there any other, say, Drew Pavlos out there that came up because of the episodes from 60 Minutes, like activist types, like doing the same sort of thing you're doing, but weren't getting the amount of attention that you've got?
I think for sure there has been. I think my case has contributed to a wider shift in the Australian public opinion about the Chinese government's authoritarianism. Like, you look at polling that shows that over the last 2 years, the Australian public's sentiment when it comes to the Chinese government, it's shifted so dramatically. It's gone from like 50, I don't know the exact numbers, but it's gone from a quite high percentage of the Australian public supporting the Chinese government or just seeing them as like a responsible partner we can work with, to now like just 20% of Australians seeing China as this responsible partner we can work with. And it wasn't just my case. It was also, of course, what was going on in Hong Kong, what was happening to Uyghurs, what the Chinese government was doing to bully Australians when it came to sanctions and the destruction of export industries and stuff like that. Like the Global Times, the Chinese state media, saber-rattling sort of mouthpiece, put out articles comparing Australia to bubblegum stuck to the sole of China's boots and stuff like that. And the Australian people, they've seen this, and they're really disgusted, I think, with the Chinese government's behaviour over the past few years. They see what's happening to Uyghurs, Tibetans, Hong Kongers, ordinary Chinese people too, and they're sickened by the Chinese government's authoritarianism, terrible atrocities that the Chinese government's carrying out. And I think it wasn't just me, but I think we have had some. I think that my case did have some kind of impact on that, in the sense that people in Australia saw, in my case, an example of the Chinese government seeking to actually export its authoritarianism abroad, the Chinese government seeking to export censorship to Australians, to people across the world. Fundamentally, the Chinese government does not want anyone speaking about these sensitive issues, such as the genocide of Uyghurs, the crackdown on Hong Kong, 500,000 Tibetans in slave labor camps. The Chinese government does not want anyone speaking about this anywhere around the world. You're not safe even if you're just an Australian, which is what my case showed, because I was, attacked by Chinese state media. Chinese state media told UQ to expel me. They cheered it on. I had all these death threats. Two Chinese diplomatic officials, like the Chinese ambassador to Cyprus. I'm of Greek Cypriot background. And man, like, because the Chinese government has this really crazy sort of fascist worldview where like every single person, you can just define them down to like their racial identity. Yeah. Like the Chinese government got the Chinese ambassador to Cyprus to condemn me, which was just crazy, because like yeah, I've got like the Cypriot heritage, but I identify solely really as an Australian. I only speak English. I've only ever been here. And suddenly, like, the Chinese ambassador to Cyprus was condemning me. And he was only condemning me because they heard I was of Chinese ancestry. I mean, no, not Chinese, Cypriot ancestry. So it's just crazy. And I think it was really telling, like, this government just has really crazy, like, it has these crazy attitudes towards, like, anyone who tries to speak out. It's just so, like, crushingly authoritarian, and it's very race-centric. It's like a Han supremacist ethno-state at this point. It views
I see it as like they're so weak that they can't handle criticism. And you'll notice when they ever, their spokespeople speak out, they'll go, well, this thing that's happened, it's very offensive to the Chinese people. Yeah. And it's like, what? Like, how weak are you guys? Like, no offense to Chinese people, but they use Chinese people as like a shield. It's like, how weak are you guys?
Well, like, they will say that condemnation of the Chinese government's genocidal policies towards Uyghurs is an attack on the Chinese people that hurts their feelings and stuff like that. It's like, well, what about the feelings of the Uyghur people,
Yeah.
It's true. This is such a sensitive government. And I've often said, like, the only reason my activism ever came to the attention of the wider public, and like let alone, and like, you know, the actual wider world, because it's gone beyond Australia.
Yeah.
The only reason for that was because of the Chinese government cracking down on me.
Yeah.
Like, I did that first protest at UQ a year and a half ago now, and we had 15, 20 people. This was a really small protest we organized for Uyghurs and Hong Kongers. And like, they could not tolerate that. They actually had to send in like a busload of guys to fucking try and bash us. And so
they must really regret, stopping your first protest, because if they just let you have your protest and have your day, then that would have been much cheaper for everybody.
This never would have happened if like that one day, July 24, 2019, where I held that one protest, none of this would have gotten to this point if like I hadn't been assaulted that day by supporters of the Chinese government. Like, we had such a small protest, they could have just like let us fade into obscurity. Like, if they just denied us oxygen, we would have literally just faded away into obscurity. I've never had any plans of being an activist or coming to the public attention, really. I didn't know any journalists when I did that first protest. I didn't know, like, I mean, I didn't have any plans for getting it out to the media or anything. I just held one small protest because I was pissed off about what was happening to Uyghurs and stuff. And like, it all blew up because they tried to crack down on us. If they just ignored us, like, man, we would have gone away with our 10, 15 people and like probably never another protest at UQ again, probably would have moved on to other issues. Like, I know it sounds horrible to say.
Yeah.
Like, because now I see that why that would have been so horrible. If I had just done that one protest and just laid aside the issue, now given everything I've learned over the past year and a half about the Chinese government's terrible authoritarianism, how it treats Uyghurs, Hong Kongers, and Tibetans and Chinese people, I know that I never, like, that's unjustifiable. You can't give up about these issues. But like, if I had gone back into time, if you get me, like, the person I was at that time, I was not really like, you know, committed to China activism. I never really envisioned that as a path or a future I wanted to go down. I never had any sort of like, I had never any inkling that I would be like, you know, continuing to campaign for Uyghurs and Hong Kongers and Tibetans like to this day. And
so
really,
now, as an expert in this field,
I'm not an expert.
how are you not an expert? Because there are Uyghur activists and Chinese activists and Hong Kong activists and Tibetan activists in Australia, but you're the one that everyone's talking about. Can you talk to us about, you know, how to make our activism more impactful? Because we do certain things, there's videos, there's hashtags, there's protests, but, you know, in your experience, what have you found that's been impactful and worked?
Yeah. See, it's really difficult, right? Probably reflecting on it, the one really core thing I think is important is reaching people where they currently are. So this is probably like one criticism I would have of, say, other sort of like critics of the CCP, like probably particularly in the sort of like Falun Gong / like, you know, Epoch Times sphere, you know, like the whole Steve Bannon Federal State of China stuff, you know, all that stuff. Like, I don't think their messaging reaches an ordinary person. I think it's like, and when they do stuff like, when they, how to say this?
So when they have their pictures, like, what do you mean?
Like for example, like one thing, like the whole sort of that new federal state of China thing has really like campaigned on is like the China virus, like with regard to coronavirus, like calling it the China virus and saying it's like a biological weapon engineered by the Chinese state. We need an independent investigation into the origins of coronavirus. But I think that type of stuff, like, I think the ordinary person, the ordinary Australian sees that, and they're just not really going to like, one, understand where they're coming from, or like, I think people see it. I just don't think it reaches people like where they currently are.
It doesn't connect.
Yeah, I just think it doesn't connect. Like, I think we have to be super, super careful. Like, where it won't connect, where our whole movement will fall down is if, like, we know the Chinese government, their propaganda line is always, these people are not critics of the Chinese government, they're haters of the Chinese people and they're racist and stuff like that. That's always the propaganda line the Chinese government runs on. And I think we have to be so mindful of that at all times. And where sometimes we might be shifting into areas where it's seemingly like actually against the Chinese people. And I think stuff like calling it the Chinese virus and stuff like that, it can be so easily like, the Chinese government can very easily say this is like a racist campaign. This is not about, you know, human rights or whatever. This is like just straight up part of the long history of racism towards Chinese people and stuff like that. And I think it just makes it so hard to build campaigns of solidarity, reach people, like, because so many people, like, and this is a problem on the left so much of the time as well. I'm probably still someone, I'd say I'm probably of the left, but the thing that really pisses me off about the left is like they take that idea, like the Chinese government will always go, all criticism of the Chinese state is anti-China racism. And the left sees that, and then as a result, they don't want to talk about China, despite the fact that a lot of these issues, I mean, like 1 million Uyghur Muslims in concentration camps. You can't tell me, like, if America was in charge of a concentration camps with 1 million with 1 million Muslims in them, or some other country, like European country or Australia, like this would be the number one focus at all times of the left. And it would be rightfully so, because that is just like such a terrible atrocity it's a crime against humanity. But then when it comes to China, so many people just don't want to talk about it because they just think talking about anything critical of the Chinese state will just feed into like the long history of Chinese racism, anti-Chinese racism or whatever. So I think really, really important to make sure that we're constantly trying to make clear we're not against the Chinese people, we're against the Chinese government and the Chinese government's authoritarian policies. It's about democracy, it's about human rights. It's not about just like hating Chinese people or great power competition. It's not about us trying to go, oh, we want America to rule the world, not China. It's not about, we have to show that it's not about these like base sort of level political, like, so it has to be about, you know, the dignity of the human person, the rights every human being are entitled to, the rights all human beings are entitled to by virtue of being, you know, just by virtue of being born. I think we really, really have to constantly be trying to take it back to the focus being human rights, democracy, the respect for the human person wherever they are born, wherever the rights are being threatened. I think that's so, so important. And I've tried my best to try and do that throughout. And the other problem, yeah, and we can talk about this, like part of this, right, means we can't, like the Chinese government will use examples of the Australian government's own human rights abuses and say, see, they're all hypocrites. They just want to embarrass China, but they don't care about human rights themselves because look what they're carrying out themselves.
So let's get into that. So you'll see China, right? They'll go, oh, don't delve into our issues, but they're happy to criticize America on you know, the Black Lives Matter, the movement. You've seen them talk about it, and then yet treat Africans that reside in China very kick them out of their own apartments. I haven't heard any statements about China criticizing Australia on what's happening in Afghanistan, but the point has to be made that we are Australians. We can complain against our government, and the government can actually punish their own officials and soldiers for war crimes they committed, but something that you'll never, ever see in China. And China has to know that's the difference. Like, thank God we live in a country, or we're Australians, where we can do this, and we're not going to be killed or put in camps or prison for criticizing our own government or disrespecting, you know.
One, we have to be consistent. So to combat the Chinese government criticism, like, you don't care about human rights, you're just trying to bash on China because look at your own crimes, you just ignore them. We have to be consistent about our moral principles. And so that means owning up and fearlessly facing the crimes Australia has committed. And so I've been a fierce critic of the Australian government's terrible refugee policies, which I believe, like, the Australian government has operated what are effectively, in my opinion, torture camps for refugees, primarily Muslim refugees offshore. And these refugees have been suffering immensely. And the Australian government continues to have a terrible record on Indigenous Australians, with Indigenous Australians living in conditions that are so impoverished, and they are denied opportunities other Australians, white Australians are able to receive. And when it comes to this case, the war crimes committed by Australian soldiers in Afghanistan, man, that made me sick to my stomach. Some of the stuff carried out there. I mean, when we want to be talking about, when we want to be criticizing the Chinese government's Islamophobia, we really, really have to be talking about the Islamophobia that is often manifested in this very extreme, violence that Australian government troops have manifested. That we need to be talking about Muslim lives when they're threatened by the Australian government just as much. Just as so. There was some terrible stories.
Like we should be depicting or be role models for but perhaps even Chinese people, so that they can go. Obviously, they don't have the capacity because they'll be punished, but still be like, hey, you know what? These guys, like, it makes us more genuine.
Yeah, we have to be genuine. We have to live our own values when it comes to human rights. So, for example, like that story with Afghanistan and some of the cases, man, made me sick to my stomach. Like Australian soldiers slitting the throats of 14-year-old Afghan boys, like civilian non-combatants, and they slit their throats and dump the bodies in a river. That's just sickening. And that is like anti-Muslim violence. It's part of the whole culture of violent Islamophobia that does exist in the Western world as well. We have to be consistent in opposing that, model our own values on human rights. And then we can show that's the difference between a democracy and a dictatorship. We can fiercely criticize our own government and fiercely attack our leaders when they are responsible for these terrible things, without the fear of being persecuted, tortured, disappeared in China.
As long as you're not Julian Assange or Edward Snowden. Just those two people.
Oh, that's true. That's honestly true. Like Edward Snowden, I actually see his treatment by the United States government so terribly hypocritical. Like, as well, Julian Assange. It's so different.
But you know what the difference is?
Yeah.
I'm not mistaken, Julian Assange's family or even Edward Snowden's family, they're living in their own countries safely, I presume. Like their whole family is not wiped out. If they were Chinese citizens, the whole family would be wiped out, 30, 40, 50 people.
It's true, like, because we know, for example, with Uyghurs, there are collective family punishments. Yeah. Like, so all my Uyghur friends here in Australia, in Brisbane, Australia, like when their families have been targeted, they've been systematically targeted. So it's very rare to find a Uyghur Australian who does not have less than 5-6 family members in the concentration camps. Everyone I know in Brisbane has more than 10. Like, you've got uncles, you've got aunts, you've got generations of the family from grandfathers down to sons, down to the son. Like, there are collective family punishments and stuff like that. Look, my major point is just we have to walk our own values when it comes to human rights, model our values. It gives us so much more moral weight when we criticize the Chinese government's horrible, horrible atrocities, which I believe are right up there with the worst committed possibly of all time. Like, I believe the Uyghur genocide will be remembered in history as one of the most terrible atrocities ever perpetrated. And we must do everything we can to fight against this Uyghur genocide. And the only way we can do that is if we have moral weight behind our criticisms of the Chinese government. If it just looks as the Chinese government wants to make it out to be, like the Chinese government wants to just portray this as a Cold War, as just like West versus China, great power competition. And we can't fall into that thing. Before the politics, it has to be the human being first. So we have to model our values, and then we show that we're modeling how democracy should behave when we criticize our own governments, and are free from fear of persecution and violence. We're modeling something that the Chinese government cannot claim to live up to. And the hypocrisy of the Chinese government's criticisms then very much become clear. I truly believe we can win the hearts and minds of millions of people around the world. And by doing that, we can have things like boycotting Chinese products, putting pressure on the Chinese government with things like boycotting the Beijing Olympics of 2022, doing everything we can economically and diplomatically to try and stop what is happening to Uyghurs, to try and secure human rights for Tibetans, Hong Kongers, Chinese people?
Let's get into the friendly Geordies, right?
Yeah,
Could you just explain to our audience who the friendly Geordies are, and we'll go from there.
It's really disappointing, right? Because he's like probably the most popular Australian voice on the center left when it comes to like media and commentary. He's probably actually the most popular like Australian media figure on the left, and his attitudes towards the Chinese government's terrible atrocities and his what he has said about Uyghurs in the past, so terrible. It's so disappointing.
Actually, you know what we'll do? Let's listen to this, and then let's get your sort of reaction to it. Yeah.
It's a big job.
It has led to a large proportion of like the Chinese population being in camps. So do we really want TikTok to have our data because somehow we'll be in those camps?
Why is that
Think about it.
Why has that led to them to being? Why has that led them to being in camps? Because they've been able to
No, it hasn't. Look,
find them better.
Dude, I don't
the
agree
reason
with
the
any of
Uyghur
it. I'm just
population
saying
is
it.
detained is because they're causing trouble, and that actually is the reason.
What, like
the thing is,
like
Like-
old school
Look, this is
Islamic
the whole
trouble?
point.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah.
You're dealing
Yes,
with
it
a
is,
country
yeah.
that is 1.3 billion. It has a third world government still running it, trying to keep this massive population of 50 ethnicities together.
Mm.
It's a big job. The reason that they are detained.
How many ethnicities?
50.
Is that right?
Could probably
Maybe.
be even more.
More.
But most of them are one ethnicity.
Chinese, mountain Chinese.
That's pretty much it.
That's
You're
not
right.
50,
Valley
dude.
Chinese.
Tibet.
East
Then
side
there's also-
Chinese.
that's
that
not-
sometimes wear Hello Kitty. You can just go on. You know the list now.
Yeah, it's still
Yep.
not 50.
All right. Chinese people that like barbecue sauce, and then it just shows an American in a steakhouse.
Chinese
Now you
people
get
that
it.
have been to UNSW.
Yeah, I know. Look, all right, I'm lying this up. There is just the 8 ethnicities that we outlined then.
Yeah.
Right? And so, but anyway, the point is, keeping all these ethnicities together, what the CIA has done over the last 30 years is exactly what they did in Afghanistan, which is radicalize the Taliban and essentially train them up. And this is exactly what they did with the Wuhan
No
people
way.
in China. It's the same
Uyghurs.
pattern.
With the Wuhan, I don't like. I mean, they've made it out to be. I don't know. They were just like very lax when they were to like make. I don't know. It was just wasn't even safe for them.
He tried to take. If you'll notice, like he tried to play off that original comment as a joke, like, "Oh, they're in the camps because they're causing trouble," and he was sort of like playing it off, like, "Oh, I'm really joking here." And one, like, I mean, it's not something to joke about, you know. Like, we don't joke, we don't accept, you know, Holocaust jokes in society. We don't accept, you know, jokes regarding terrible atrocities.
And Facebook now doesn't accept any postings about the whole like fake, like to say that the Holocaust never happened. They won't accept that. They'll block your page and get rid of you. And then, but
Well,
they'll
like,
let all this Chinese propaganda and on Twitter as well. And
yeah, I mean, my take is, you know, if we're trying to crack down on other forms of genocide denialism, then we have to be serious about cracking down on Uyghur genocide denialism as well.
Yeah.
And so he plays it off as a joke at the first part, like he's got a smirk on his face and his mate's laughing, but then he goes into like actually outright trying to defend it, and then he starts to echo Chinese government propaganda points where he goes, you know, oh, China's this vast country of many different ethnicities, and thus, like the Chinese Communist Party, a strong central government is very necessary to hold it all together because they're the only things between holding the country together in absolute chaos. So, like, you know, he plays into that Chinese government propaganda line, and then he goes into the whole, and this is the part where it gets really cooked, where he starts actually going, like, there's a real Uyghur terrorism problem, and they've been radicalized by the CIA, and it's, you know, Western attempts to split up China, and that's why the Chinese government's crackdown on Uyghurs is justified. And one, like, it is such an outright lie to pretend there is a Uyghur terrorism problem. We know that, for example, the ETIM, an organization that the US government used to list as a terrorist organization. My understanding is that the US government listed ETIM as a terrorist organization in the lead up to the Iraq War in order to secure China's support for that war, to make sure China would not veto that war at the UN Security Council. And then and so they basically just did it straightforwardly for cynical political reasons. There was not really any justified reason for that. And like now it's being
I had the honor of talking to Dr. Sean Roberts. He wrote a book and had a big chunk on ETIM. And he even said, but before Secretary Pompeo came out and said, we don't regard ETIM as a terrorist group anymore, in his book, and this was done way before, he was saying there is actually no evidence that ETIM has ever committed any terrorist acts ever. There's nothing. So it was purely to please China.
Yeah, well, that's definitely the case with ETIM. Like, I know the Chinese government does point to some isolated terrorist attacks that it claims are like Uyghur motivated. So, I mean, they point to the Kunming 2014 stabbing attacks, I believe, and a few other suicide attacks and stuff like that. Look, I know. Look, it's very hard to trust the Chinese government when it comes to like actually assessing the validity of like linking these terrorist attacks to Uyghurs, because it's so hard to trust anything the Chinese government says, especially when it comes to this ethnic minority, because for decades they've been looking for justification for trying to basically try to marginalize, sideline Uyghurs in their own home country. Like, it starts all the way back. I mean, it starts all the way back in the Qing dynasty, right? When like the first Han settlers came, and then after World War II and the communists took control of East Turkestan, named it Xinjiang, new territories, new frontier, new borderlands in Chinese, which speaks to the whole colonial mindset, and starting bringing in settlers and seizing the arable land and displacing Uyghurs in their own home country. For decades and decades, there's been a consistent Chinese government policy to try and basically eliminate Uyghurs as a distinct kind of political and ethnic grouping. And like the anti-terror thing, I think, was just convenient justification for the Chinese government. And so it's a convenient pretext for this whole completely unjustified crackdown. I mean, if it really were an anti-terror crackdown, I mean, why do you have to have like generations of families imprisoned in these concentration camps? Why do you have the slave labor? Why do you have to have forced Uyghur abortions? Why do you have to sterilize Uyghur women? Why do you have to destroy Uyghur cultural shrines and bulldoze Uyghur cemeteries? How is it an anti-terror policy to bulldoze Uyghur cemeteries? It so clearly goes far beyond an anti-terror campaign. What it clearly is a campaign of genocide. It's an attempt to wipe out Uyghurs culturally, and it's an attempt to wipe out Uyghurs as a distinct ethnic group. That's why you have the forced marriages. That's why you have the forced abortions and the sterilizations. That doesn't play into. Tell me, how does forcing a Uyghur woman to marry a Han man, how does that stop terrorism if that's an anti-terror policy? Why do you have to destroy the most sacred Uyghur shrines? Like, how does that link to anti-terrorism? It's so clearly beyond an anti-terror campaign. It's a campaign to eliminate Uyghurs as a distinct group and using anti-terrorism as a pretext.
Solution-wise, I mean, I was talking to an Emily Riley a couple of weeks ago, and she's a human rights lawyer in the UN, and she was telling, she's a whistleblower that came out and said the UN has been giving the names to the Chinese regime, the speakers of the Uyghur names, and like, we've been preaching to these guys saying, UN do something about it, but then, like, solution-wise, where else do you think what should we be doing? And then what happened was, I saw this tweet. I'm not sure if you agree, but I just found this tweet interesting. And I've been kind of saying the same message for a while as well. You probably know Benedict Rogers.
Yeah, great guy.
And he tweeted, "I don't want war. I don't advocate war, but we really need to prepare for war." What do you think solution-wise?
I would never want an offensive war against
Yeah.
China because we have to be clear-sighted that war with China would be absolutely devastating. It would be a nuclear conflict, and
Yeah.
any conflict that escalates to the nuclear level, we're going to be talking about nuclear holocaust and nuclear winter and the destruction not just of like, you know, our allies and ourselves, but the destruction of human civilization.
Yeah.
Full stop. So war has to be the last option. But if the Chinese government continues to aggressively try and bully other countries through military means and stuff like that, we have to form a defensive alliance. We have to act defensively as the Chinese government continues its aggression. It's so difficult because of the Chinese government's military might. I think the bare minimum we should be doing is calling for boycotts, divestment, sanctions. So,
Yeah.
I mean, that's a strategy that is employed by, you know, Palestinian groups against Israeli, what they describe as Israeli apartheid. And it's a policy that worked against South African apartheid. Boycotting Chinese good, boycotting, you know, Chinese events like the Beijing Olympics of 2022, divesting from Chinese government.
That's what I wanted to point out. Essentially, that's what your campaigns has been all about. If you get to the crux of it, it's all about money.
Yeah, and
The YouTube
exactly.
was attacking you. It's because it's about money at the end of the day.
That was the thing that first brought me into it, right? Because I've always been someone who identified on the left. Like I've always hated inequality. I look upon, you know, the business leaders who enrich themselves at the expense of ordinary people, and I see them as so immoral. And I was looking around and I was going, where's the left on China? Because we're being expected to shut ourselves up about a genocide against Muslims because the business leaders of Australia make too much money trading with China. And, you know, these Australian billionaires want the money flows to keep going. And we're being expected to silence ourselves. And my university is taking hundreds of millions of dollars each year just so that they can give the university executives $1 million salaries while people are starving in Australia. And they're expecting us to be silent about it as well because they want to protect their own economic interests. So that was actually the issue that brought me into it. I was like, where's the left on this? And I was like, well, I'll do a protest. I'll speak up. It's always been for me about like sort of boycott, divestment, sanctions. I think that's the bare minimum you can do ethically, because anything else I would argue is complicity. If you're continuing to do tens of billions of dollars in trade each year with China while they've got Uyghurs in concentration camps, millions of Uyghurs in concentration camps, I see that as complicity in genocide. All the people enriching themselves off China while this occurs, I see them as enriching themselves through blood money.
All right, let's get to our last topic. I say it's not over until the fat liberal lady sings.
Yeah.
US elections. What do you think?
Oh, the US election, right? Look, I've actually been preparing a YouTube video, right?
Yeah.
Because I wanted to explore this issue because I've been criticized very heavily by a lot of, you know, comrades in the movement to oppose the CCP for opposing Trump and preferring Biden to win the election. You know, I've never been a massive Biden fan. Don't like him that much, but I prefer him to Trump because I see authoritarian tendencies in Trump. I think he's always had this affinity for authoritarian leaders. He's always got along with people like Xi Jinping. And so I wanted to make a YouTube video where, like, to actually strip back the myth making and look at Trump's actual actions when it comes to China. So I know Uyghurs credit him with the Uyghur Human Rights Act that was passed, and that was amazing legislation. I looked into that in the process of researching this video I'm writing, and Trump had to be dragged kicking and screaming to that.
Yeah.
There was a bipartisan majority in Congress. Democrats and Republicans, Marco Rubio, you know, honorable Republicans like Marco Rubio were calling for Trump to do something about this. And they had to drag him kicking and screaming. They had to have a huge supermajority in Congress that meant President Trump couldn't veto the legislation as he had previously threatened to do when it came to Hong Kong human rights legislation. They had to pass this legislation with a veto-proof supermajority to force Trump to sign it, so that if he did veto it, Congress would have the numbers to pass it and make it law anyway. And the reason for that was because, one, he saw himself as having a good personal relationship with Xi. He often called him, an incredible guy, great friend of mine, etc. I don't see that as, I mean, some people dismiss that as just, diplomacy, but I think, when it comes to a guy who is in charge of a genocidal ethno-state, do you call him your incredible mate, your incredible friend? Trump praised Xi Jinping when Xi Jinping abolished term limits for himself and declared himself president for life. Trump said, you know what, he did it, good on him. And he praised the Chinese government's authoritarian response to, say, like the Tiananmen massacre. You go all the way back to 1990. He did a Playboy interview where he said, the Chinese government, yes, they were brutal and they were vicious, but they put it down with strength, and strength is what you need because all the countries in the world are laughing at the United States right now. He was basically saying, the Tiananmen Square, like Tiananmen massacre, yes, it was horrible, but like America needs that type of strength because we're being laughed at because we care about human rights. And yeah, on the Uyghur human rights issue, that specific legislation, the Uyghur Human Rights Act, which I think, honestly, like, you go back for decades in America, honestly, some of the most pivotal legislation ever been passed on matters of human rights internationally. That was such an important piece of legislation. And Trump had to be dragged kicking and screaming to it by both Democrats and Republicans, a supermajority in Congress. And when later he was asked why that was, he said, we had a trade deal going on, we had negotiations, and so we couldn't talk about Uyghurs because we wanted to make sure we got a good deal for American farmers. Trump wanted a $250 billion deal with China where China would buy up all these American goods like soya beans and stuff like that. That was Trump's price that he put on the existence of the Uyghur people. I mean, I know I'm sounding very strong here and very harsh on Trump, but I think that's ultimately what he meant when he said, when he was willing to put the trade deal before Uyghur lives, and he was going, yes, what's happening to Uyghurs was really bad, but we had a $250 billion trade deal to think about. I mean, was that the price he was putting on the continued existence of the Uyghur people? If he had got the $250 billion trade deal, I truly think he just would have forgotten Uyghurs. He never would have cared once again. There was testimony from within the White House, ex-official John Bolton, and you have to take everything John Bolton says with a grain of salt because disgruntled ex-employee plus the guy is a maniac when it comes to warmongering. Like, he's wanted to bomb every place on earth. So John Bolton, very sus guy, but he wrote in his own book, like, during a conversation with Xi Jinping, Trump had said to Xi Jinping, the Uyghur concentration camp, like the Uyghur re-education camps, that was the right response by China. They were addressing Islamic terrorism the right way. That's what Trump said to Xi Jinping. I know it's John Bolton who said that, and we should take everything John Bolton says with a grain of salt. But it wasn't just John Bolton. Like, there were other White House officials that confirmed that meeting. Trump had gone. Xi Jinping had just said to Trump, this is what we're doing to stop radical Islamic terrorism. And Trump, without really knowing much about the Uyghur issue, without really caring much about it, he just was like, Islamic terrorism, good on you. Like, this is the same guy that tried to ban Muslims from coming to the United States. Yeah. He never was really going to care about Uyghur lives. So he had to be forced to this issue. So that's the main reason. I don't think people that oppose the CCP should really like Trump. It was the same with Hong Kong. Like, the Hong Kong human rights legislation, he openly talked. At one point, he called the Hong Kong protests riots, which was, the Chinese government's term for them. And so many Hong Kongers, they were sent to prison for 10, 15 years because they were charged with rioting. And it was one of the 5 demands of the Hong Kong protesters for the authorities to withdraw the riot designation so that they would no longer be subject to that. Because when the Chinese government was using the riot designation, they could charge people with rioting the specific offense, which would carry draconian penalties. So key demand of the Hong Kong movement. And Trump went along and said, Hong Kong's a part of China. Hong Kong is having riots. And then when it came to the human rights legislation, he was like, I might veto it because we've got the trade deal to think about. And the only thing that stopped him from doing that was, again, being dragged by both Democrats and Republicans. It wasn't a left or right issue in the American Congress. 99% of Congress people voted for this human rights legislation in Hong Kong. And so Trump had no option to veto it. He that option was taken away from him. And he was pissed off when he signed it. He actually said, yes, I'm going to sign it, but I believe it impinges on my constitutional authority as president to decide America's foreign policy. So I will decide whether I will whether I will actually apply the legislation to Hong Kong. I'll be the ultimate. Yes, it's going to be law, but I'll be the ultimate person who decides whether we actually like apply it. He was to that like he was so resistant. So this is my criticism of Trump. I think when you actually look deep down, like, yes, he has been very tough on China. I acknowledge that he's attacked China so much. But if you look at the concrete at a concrete level, the attacks on China, I don't think were ever really much about Uyghurs, Hong Kongers, Tibetans, Chinese people. It was always about, oh, China might overtake the US. We have to stop that from happening. And if he could stop that from happening without caring about Hong Kongers, Tibetans, Uyghurs, like he would have gone down that path. I don't think he really ever cared about the individual people who are suffering. That's my criticism of Trump. I've been attacked a lot for it. Some people have said I've actually been like bought off by the CCP for arguing that, even though like I've dedicated a lot of my life to fighting the CCP. But it's based off my analysis of Trump's concrete policies when it comes to human rights.
Let's get one question from one of our followers.
Yeah, sure.
They've written, "Hi Drew, so how do you suggest Australia balance the economy dependent on China and broader human rights?"
Well, I think human rights has to be absolutely central to our foreign policy and to how we approach, dealing with the international community. I think the problem is so great for Australia right now because we're so tied into the Chinese economy, and the Chinese government has shown in recent days where it's leveled these sanctions against the Australian government to punish Australia. It's shown that it's very much willing to use that leverage to bully Australia. Like, it's basically waged economic warfare on Australia. So our current situation where we are so dependent on China is absolutely terrible for our national security. It's terrible for our democracy. It's terrible if you care about human rights, because so many people in Australian society can be bought off by this economic leverage. I think the only thing you can do, massive government investment, and this is the part where I am a lefty, you have the government investing so many billions and billions into building up Australian infrastructure, building up Australian manufacturing again, like rebuilding the Australian economy from the ground up. Like, there's no
like a socialist.
Sorry?
You sounded like a socialist.
I mean, well, Blackadder argues the same stuff, like you have to, like we've been selling off we've been privatizing key sectors of the economy. We've been selling off Australian land, and you can't if you can't protect, like if key sectors of your economy and large tracts of your land are controlled by a government that is willing to use that to bully you into submission, like it's absolute danger to your democracy. So, I mean, we need to be stopping this wave of privatizations, taking things back into public control, building up new export markets, building up huge infrastructure. Like, man, I would be talking, I look at Queensland, right? And I'm in the state of Queensland, and the state of Queensland is so dependent on China because we're basically a fossil fuel export state, and we export all the coal, all the iron ore, all to China. Our economy, billions and billions and billions each year, is dependent on China. Now, what do? I would actually go down the path of a Green New Deal, like actually building up these huge new Australian industries. You build these vast Australian solar panels. You build vast solar panel arrays across the desert. You build vast windmills. You use dams, hydropower. You build up these renewable sources of energy, cheap energy for Australians to use in the regional towns. And then with these huge abundant resources of cheap energy, you then start building up huge manufacturing again. You bring manufacturing jobs back to Australia. We should be at the forefront of building electric cars in the world. So, like, that's what you should do in regional Queensland.
So what you're trying to say is we should make Australia great again.
It's sort of, I mean, you like a town like you go out to regional Queensland where all the jobs are dependent on the fossil fuel industry, and that's dependent on China. You would be bringing in, you can invest billions of dollars into huge, vast solar panel arrays in the desert, and then guarantee every single person in the fossil fuel industry right now gets a well-paid, decent job working in the new manufacturing sector that we build up based on that renewable power center. And so every single person who's currently, working in the mines, they get a job in the new car manufacturing plants. The new, like we build up Australian industry, we build up the Australian economy, we build up the resilience of the Australia's democracy through that. We need to just revolutionize the economy, man, so that it's no longer dependent on a government that's a terrible threat, a terrible totalitarian threat internationally.
Drew, thank you so much for your time. Everybody, you can follow Drew here. There's a link there, Linktree. That's where you can find all these details of his social media, and you can donate to, like, all the donation links are there as well. Before I let you go, is there any last words that you want to say?
Yeah, well, like, what coming into that, I'm going to be starting a non-profit. We've registered a non-profit, Defend Democracy. So if you go to the Linktree, you can go donate to Defend Democracy. That will be properly ready to launch soon. We will try. My vision, I'm not sure, the International Parliamentary Alliance on China?
Yeah.
Which is like a grouping of legislators across the world who are like united in opposing the Chinese government's human rights abuses, its aggressive behavior. My big vision is we have something like that, but for ordinary citizens. So like something like IPAC, but citizens around the world, they don't have to be legislators. You can just be an ordinary Australian, an ordinary person from New Zealand, Europe, Africa, Turkey, Middle East, anywhere. You can join up to Defend Democracy, and together, people power, we can stand up, collectively call for boycotts when the Chinese government is taking these terrible human rights atrocities, taking out these terrible human rights abuses, call for boycotts, petitions to move the Olympic Games, like applying political pressure to our legislators when the legislators are selling out to, China because of economic interests and stuff like that. My vision is a big people-powered movement to lobby for governments to get real about this totalitarian threat, put human rights at the center of their foreign policy, and put defending our democracy at the center of our, great concerns. The non-profit's called Defend Democracy. And the whole idea is, together we'd be standing together across countries, thousands and thousands of people trying to resist the Chinese government's aggressive behavior internationally and its terrible human rights abuses.
Well, thank you so much for your time again.
Thank you, man.
Let's do another one after the inquiry is finished. Perhaps like 4, 5, 6 months time again, just to catch up with you, because your story is just getting more interesting.
Yeah.
I want people to sort of get an idea of how activism can be done, like on an impactful level. So that's why I've got you back.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, so everybody, again, make sure you're following Drew, what he's up to, and basically you can take him as your role model, because I do. He's doing a lot of great work.
Oh, thank you, bro. That means a lot.
I want to say salam to all the brothers and sisters that have joined on Talkies Turkestan. Make sure you share, like this video, and till next time, Drew.
Thank you, brother. Thank you so much, Aslan. Really appreciate it, bro. Great talks. And thank you so much, everyone, for listening. Cheers.